Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Speak for Yourself podcast. My name is Casey, and I'm so glad that you're joining us now or that you will listen later on whatever your preferred listening channel is, whether that's Spotify or YouTube, um, Odyssey or anything like that. Anyway, I'm so happy to introduce my next guest, Mr. Scott Horton. He is one of the guys that is primarily responsible for my education on the Ukraine and Russia war and on global conflicts and just how all of that has been played out and you know things that happened before I was of age to really understand what was going on. So it's been a privilege, Scott, to listen to you speak in so many other interviews. And it's a privilege to have you on this podcast. So I really appreciate you coming on.
Happy to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, man. So I want to kind of get straight into it. The Russia-Ukraine conflict. Um, One of the things that's very interesting that the media doesn't speak on, because they're liars, frankly, is the history of that conflict going all the way back to 2014 and even before that, really. Can you give a history of it leading up to where we are now and why that's so important to understand that context when looking at it?
Sure. Well, so I'm working on a book about this now, which I hope will be done kind of by the end of the year, maybe the beginning of next year. And the book starts with H.W. Bush in the early 90s, really at the end of the last Cold War. And Ukraine itself doesn't quite come up yet, but the context is important. And especially for young people who really don't understand, I guess I'll tell you the Cold War itself. After World War II, the Soviet Union, the communist Soviet Union, which was in a way the Russian Empire, but more than that too, the Commie Empire, they ruled all of Eastern Europe, including half of Germany, and everything east of that was ruled by the commies. Then in the H.W. Bush years, the Soviet Union started breaking apart. It took a couple of years to happen. And first, they started letting the Eastern European states go. And that was, one of the steps of the process. The Americans were intent on reuniting Germany under the NATO alliance. In other words, under American military domination, so that the world doesn't have to deal with an independent Germany with its own foreign policy again. And we have friends and, compliant friends in West Germany. We want to keep them in charge and keep America in there. And so they made a deal with Gorbachev, the last dictator of the Soviet Union, that if he would pull his troops out of Germany and allow Germany to reunite, so it had been divided east and west, and if he would allow Germany to reunite and pull his troops out, then America would not move its NATO alliance 1 inch east of that. Now, it's true, and people quibble about this, that in that particular context, they were talking about moving the troops anywhere east inside Germany. But that's just that one statement, that one day. There's an entire constellation of arguments made by the American, German, French, and British politicians, the presidents and prime ministers and their secretaries of state and foreign ministers and everything, that this applied to all the land east of Germany, of course, as well. And so it was on that understanding that the Soviets withdrew and signed the deal to allow the reunification of Germany, and ended up withdrawing further from the rest of Eastern Europe. And finally, the Soviet Union fell apart all the way, was dead and gone by Christmas Day, 1991. So the thing is, the Bush people had told the Soviets and then the Russians that they were going to replace NATO, which was America's anti-Soviet military alliance, with this new structure called the Partnership for Peace. And the Russians could be partners in it. It wouldn't be an alliance against anyone because there's no one to be against. So it would just be a common security architecture type thing, sort of minimalist type security arrangement for Europe. and that NATO would be turned into more of a political organization like the EU, only including the US. But they were lying, and they knew they were lying. They were just telling the Reds and then the Russians after that what they thought they needed to hear in order to get out of the way and allow America to do what they needed to do. They weren't going to be ready to expand NATO yet anyway, and they wanted to just buy their time. So Bill Clinton comes in, and Bill Clinton does a lot of things, but the most important thing for our discussion here is, well, there's a bunch of them, but he expanded the NATO military alliance. He added Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary in 1999. And at the same time, in fact, just a few weeks later, he launched the war in Kosovo, which was the second of his major wars in the Balkans against the Russians' allies, the Serbs, and, helped to destroy the Russian economy in the 1990s, rigged the election of 1996 to keep Yeltsin in there when the people wanted rid of him, and all these other things. Then W. Bush comes in. He tears up the anti-ballistic missile treaty with Russia, even though Putin was the first one to call him on September 11th and offer to open up the northern route into Afghanistan and former Soviet bases in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan for the Americans to stage out of. And when he asked, he had asked Clinton this, and then he asked Bush this, hey, what about letting us join NATO? He's got the cold shoulder, because Russia's too big and powerful and has too many nukes. And unlike Germany or Britain, if we allowed them into NATO, we'd have to actually ask them their opinion about things sometimes, telling them what to do all the time. We'd have to share the power, and they just don't want to do that. They would rather keep NATO as a dagger to point at Russia than include them in on it. And and I should have said Clinton started this, but W. Bush continued what are called the color-coded revolutions, which are essentially coups d'etats dressed up as revolutions, where they overthrow the government of essentially any state that's friendly to Russia and Russia's near abroad. And they call it democracy, but in most cases, what they're doing is they're taking the side of the losers of the election and then refusing to accept the result and waging some kind of insurrection and trying to overthrow the thing. It's okay when the Democrats do it, you understand. And when W. Bush does it. And then also very importantly, Bush installed you've heard of this, the anti-ballistic missile systems in Romania and Poland. Now, the thing about these is they claim that they're for shooting down incoming missiles from Iran, but Iran doesn't have missiles that can reach Poland, and they don't have any nuclear weapons anyway. What are they going to do? They're going to hit Poland with a 500-pound warhead or something? I mean, I don't know. The whole thing's ridiculous. It's clearly geared toward Russia, but in a way that's nonsensical too, because it's not nearly enough missiles to be able to shoot down an incoming salvo from the Russians. And W. Bush said that. He goes, Vlad, you're paranoid, man. This wouldn't be enough missiles to shoot down an incoming salvo from you anyway, so don't worry about it. And Putin said, that makes a lot of sense, so maybe that's not what it is. Maybe it's the fact that the missile launchers, the Mark 41 missile launchers that hold the Sparrow anti-missile missiles, can also hold Tomahawk cruise missiles. They're dual-use launchers. They hold Tomahawks, and those can be tipped with H-bombs. Currently, they're not under treaty, but that could change. And in fact, it may have been the INF treaty that prevented that, and that Donald Trump later tore up. Anyway, and then he also added 9 more countries to NATO, including the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, right on Russia's border. And he was not able to do an official invitation to Ukraine and Georgia. That's former Soviet Georgia, tiny little country between the Black and Caspian Sea, the southern Caucasus Mountains there, north of Azerbaijan. Not the one between South Carolina and Florida that we all care about so much. Bush was unable to convince the Germans and the French to let him give an official invitation to Georgia and Ukraine in 2008. Because why? They were afraid of unnecessarily provoking the Russians. And even though I kind of left this out, but I should have mentioned that Boris Yeltsin and Vladimir Putin had been screaming and hollering about NATO expansion the whole time and opposing it as much as they could. They didn't really have any power to oppose it or any chips to play, but they've complained about it all along. and especially with the Baltic states right on their border, there north of Belarus. But now, when it came to Ukraine, the Germans, their chancellor was Angela Merkel at the time. She put her foot down and would not let Bush give them what's called a membership action plan to join. But they compromised, and they still let him put out a statement saying, well, we're going to let Ukraine and Georgia into NATO someday. And by doing that, it was the same difference. They might as well have offered them official membership at that point. They made it very clear what they were trying to do. And so this led to the war in Georgia in August of 2008, when the sock puppet that had been placed in power in the Rose Revolution of 2003, which was one of these color-coded revolutions, Mikhail Saakashvili was his name, on the presumption that he could get into NATO, he decided that he had to resolve his outstanding border disputes. There are two breakaway provinces of Georgia called South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And in order to join NATO, he would have to resolve those outstanding border disputes, because you can't join, it's in the official doctrine. You cannot join the NATO alliance if you have an outstanding border dispute with your neighbors. Otherwise, the whole alliance are going to have to go straight to war for you, right? So to try to solve that problem, and with some encouragement, especially from the vice president's office, apparently, and Victoria Nuland and them, he tried it, and he attacked South Ossetia in early August. And in doing so, killed Russian peacekeepers. I think just 2 of them, but it was enough. They were there under a deal that had been brokered by the EU, a legitimate deal. And when the Russians were killed, that was then the green light for the Russian army to come through what's called the Roki Tunnel under the Caucasus Mountains, and then to push the Georgian forces out of Abkhazia, which is exactly what they did. And this could have led to a war. It's pretty well reported, I think, that I got 2 or 3 sources on this, that that Dick Cheney and or people on his staff perhaps were proposing strikes against the Russians coming through the Roki Tunnel, to collapse the Roki Tunnel and kill the Russians coming under the mountains. And W. Bush said, anybody here agree with that, want to do that? And everybody else was like, no way. And so it died. But we could have gone to war with Russia right then.
Good.
So then Obama comes in. Obama does a lot of horrible things, but the very worst things he does is, first of all, Syria, and then also Ukraine. Now, in Syria, he commits the high treason of taking al-Qaeda's side against the Shiite-aligned government in Damascus to try to make up for the terrible error, W. Bush's error of Iraq War II, where he put Iran's best friends in the Shiite community in power in Baghdad. Now they had to try to fix that by taking Damascus away from Iran and putting Sunnis in charge. But they only have suicide bombing, head chopping lunatics to do it. There are no moderate rebels, and the whole thing is absolute catastrophe. And as everyone listening recalls, led directly to the rise of the Islamic State Caliphate under this guy Baghdadi, who ended up conquering Western Iraq and necessitating the launch of Iraq War III from 2014 through 17 in order to destroy it again. And in the important part concerning Russia here is that Syria is a Russian client state. And so they finally intervened at the end of 2015 in order to prevent ISIS and al-Qaeda from, who were working together on this project, to march on Damascus and overthrow the government there to finally win the war. And he intervened to prevent that at that time. But you know, as bad as it is, just thinking about it from here, Obama taking al-Qaeda's side after September 11th and after they had been the worst part of the Sunni insurgency in Iraq War II. Look at a map and how close this territory is to Russia. You know, they get off of September 11th or 2 against us every once in a while. That's nothing compared to literally having tens of thousands of these guys swarming in essentially what's Russia's Mexico, right? And they're near abroad in their, you know, direct south. So this was a major threat to their national security to do, and cause real problems between America and the United States. I mean, America and Russia. And then the worst thing of all was the coup of 2014, which you alluded to in the beginning there. Now, W. Bush had overthrown the government in 2004 in the Orange Revolution. And in that case, they had prevented this guy, Viktor Yanukovych, from assuming the presidency in what they said was a rigged vote, which may very well have been. But they did a very rigged protest movement backed by foreign millions in order to get the opposite result. But the guys who won the Orange Revolution were so corrupt that they'd been thrown out within just a few years, and Yanukovych was elected again in 2010 in a free and fair election. And so what happened was he was from the east of the country in what's called the Party of Regions, which is, a sort of pro-Russian party led by ex-commie officials from the old days and stuff. But he was not just some Russian stooge. And in fact, he really was leaning toward the West and was to sign a trade deal with the EU. The EU drove too hard a bargain, led by the Germans, drove too hard a bargain. And that was even George Soros himself blamed Angela Merkel for botching the deal by being too unwilling to compromise with Yanukovych to get the trade deal through. Well, the Russians were playing nice and were offering discounts on gas and low interest loans, and I think even a massive grant of billions of dollars that they wouldn't even have to pay back. And so Yanukovych told the EU no and signed the deal with Russia instead. And that caused the people in the far west of the country, who are not necessarily pro-EU, but are very anti-Russia, to go out and protest. And the Americans and, their Western allies essentially saw their, advantage here and their opportunity to try to replicate what they did with the Orange Revolution. And all these NED backed, that's the National Endowment for Democracy, backed so-called non-governmental organizations, poured millions of dollars into this protest movement from the end of November all the way through February, which eventually culminated in a violent street putsch and a threat by neo-Nazis to kill the president if he didn't leave town. And it was a credible enough threat that he absolutely did leave town. And, this is the American ambassador to Ukraine tweeted out, "All right, this was one for the history books," just bragging about it. Chris Murphy, the senator, went on C-SPAN. This was recently unearthed by Michael Tracy, I believe. Went on C-SPAN and bragged that, yeah, we played the central role in getting this accomplished and that all that kind of thing back then. Well, this led, of course, directly to the Russians' re-seizure and re-annexation of the Crimean Peninsula, and then the outbreak of war in the East. And of course, it gets all very complicated, but basically the entire southern coast and far eastern part of Ukraine used to be part of Russia. It was called Nova Russia. And it was part of the Russian Empire since the 1770s, 1780s, or even before. I know Crimea officially became part of the Russian Empire in 1783, the same year that we signed our peace with Britain at the end of the Revolutionary War, 4 years before our Constitution was even written. And so, Crimea is part of Russia, like New York is part of the United States, essentially. And it was just a quirk of history, basically, that during the Soviet Union era, after Stalin died, Khrushchev needed the support of the Communist Party of Ukraine in order to succeed Stalin. So in 1954, the general secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Premier Khrushchev, issued an edict. I say all that mocking his authority, of course, right? It's not like this is what we the people ordain or the divine right of Solomon's temple or some crap. This is some commie said so. That's all they got. That that Crimea now belongs to Ukraine. And at the end of the Soviet Union, Crimea stayed with Ukraine, but it was always a very kind of tense and compromised situation all through the 1990s. But the reality is basically the status quo had held, that the Crimean Peninsula belonged to Ukraine as long as the Russians could keep their naval base there. It wasn't until after the second coup in 10 years, backed by the United States. And then when four, or was it three? I believe it was four former Ukrainian presidents wrote a letter saying now's the time to cancel the Kharkiv Agreement, which was the deal that allowed Russia to stay in Crimea. at their only year-round warm water naval port that they've held again since the 1780s. And they said, now's the time to kick the Russians out of the port. And Vladimir Putin said, no, thank you. I know what I'll do. I'll just keep the whole damn peninsula instead, which is what he did, and send his Marines and sailors out to seize it. And I don't think there's really any dispute that the vast majority, super majority of the population of Crimea wanted it that way anyway. And we're happy to be annexed by Russia and rejoin Russia. Although, of course, there was some kind of substantial minority of Ukrainians and Tatars and others who may not have wanted to join Russia. Still, it was America. I think the vast majority did, and it was America that forced the issue and forced the change before the Russians did. And then in the East, you had people who, again, massive numbers of Ukrainians, although led by apparently some Russian agents, declared autonomy. They didn't really secede from the Union. They're always called secessionists. They really just were demanding statehood, right? Like strong federalism. And the new government went to war against them, called it an anti-terrorist operation, and started bombing the crap out of them. And, for the year, almost the entire year of 2014, from say like mid-April, or I guess early April, all the way through the end of the year, it was absolutely terrible fighting. Something like 10,000 people were killed until they made the Minsk, what were called the Minsk II deals in November 14 and February of 15. And that ratcheted the fighting down, but it didn't really end it. It was a ceasefire, not a peace deal. And it wasn't a good enough of a ceasefire at all. The OSCE documented all kinds of violations, and approximately another 4,000 people were killed between the Minsk II deal in February of 15 and the outbreak of what's now called the full-scale invasion, although I'll tell you what, it could be worse, that took place in February of 22. And now, so Trump essentially, as you know, was framed for treason with Russia. Yeah. I don't know if he was ever going to really figure out how to get along with Russia. They said about Trump, the Russia experts themselves said about Trump that, well, he's like the captain of the ship. He's holding the wheel, but it's not attached to anything. And it's just, again, what they call the deep state, right? They decide. They have the Russia policy. In fact, I have a lot of huge quotes that'll have to be trimmed down in my book, but I encourage people to go and look at the testimony of Alexander Vindman, who is a Ukrainian American Army lieutenant colonel on the National Security Council staff, who testified against Trump at his impeachment and was one of the ones, who got Trump impeached on Ukrainegate. And what you'll see is Vindman says over and over and over again, with no idea how ridiculous he sounds at all, that the government decided what the policy was. The interagency, as he calls it, which I guess you and I should mostly understand to mean the deputies committee meeting, right? Not when the leaders of the departments, but their deputies all get together and meet, state and defense and whichever experts from the NSC and whatever, and they get together and they decide what they want to do. That's the policy. And Vindman is just beside himself that the president of the United States thinks that he has the right to change the policy. Who the hell does this guy think he is? We have a Russia and Ukraine policy, and it goes like this. And it's been decided by the likes of Vindman. And this is essentially, he's accusing Trump that this is the crime, that Trump wants to change the policy, even though Trump is the one who won the election. He's the one who's the president of the United States and is supposedly the one who has the authority to decide. But Vindman, because he didn't really realize how crazy he sounded, he was speaking for the rest of them, that was exactly how they saw it, was who the hell does this guy think he is to win an election and change the policy to the one that he ran on, that the people voted for? Absolutely not. And so that was part of the motivation for keeping the Russia thing going, as they even said, that the FBI said to CNN, well, it's to rein him in, prevent him from being able to change the policy too greatly. If we can't overthrow him with the 25th Amendment and drive him out of power, we can at least rein him in and prevent him from essentially ending the new Cold War. Now, I'm not a Trump guy, and that sounds like a stiff defense of him. It's only because his accusers were damn liars and the worst people in the world. And the things that they accused him of doing especially in that treason with Russia, was just an absolute hoax. Never happened whatsoever. Might as well be David Koresh's weapons of mass destruction or whatever hoax that they're, yarn that they're spinning is all it was. So then during the 4 years of Trump, what happened was the Pentagon ran the show. The NSC and the State Department and the CIA ran the show, and they did what they wanted. And you saw, they added, you might remember this clip. Tucker Carlson says to Trump, geez, we just added Montenegro and Northern Macedonia to NATO. That just seems crazy. Like, what are they going to do? Defend us in a war? All we're doing, we're signing up for them to get us into a war. And Donald Trump goes, yeah, I know. Can you believe that? And it's like, yeah, but dude, you're the president right now. You don't even know. He's too busy watching the women on TV, clucking their heads off about him to know what in the world is going on in his own government and in his own policy at all. It's just who he is, part of his character, that he's just stuck that way. That's what he thinks politics is. It's not all these power factions and their agendas. It's what are the ladies on TV saying about him right now? That's all he cares about. He's a bimbo is what he is, more than any other thing. And so even where he, had the right idea, he was unable to see any of that through. And so what they do, they escalate, they added these two countries to NATO. They massively escalated arms sales to Ukraine. They massively escalated training in the Black and Baltic Seas with our Navy and Air Force war games. I mean, this is the kind of thing, the Russians don't do this to us. Imagine if this was going on a constant basis. The Russians flying 12 and a half miles off our coast just to force us to light up our radars, essentially practicing nuclear first strikes on our country. We do that constantly to Russia in the Black Sea area, in the Baltic Sea, and what's called the Okhotsk Sea. I always say it wrong. Sorry. They say, what is it? Okhotsk. The I can't say it, dude. Leave me alone.
That's a weird one. Yeah.
The one over there by Vladivostok, over there in the Far East. And we're just flying our nuclear bombers off of their coast constantly, forcing them to light up their radars. And this kind of harassment all the time. And then Biden comes in, and Biden spends essentially the whole first year doing everything he can to provoke the Russians and doing absolutely nothing to placate them. And especially in September, October, November of 21, he announced, he had the State Department and the Defense Department put out all these policy papers declaring essentially the continuation, the reaffirmation of the United States of Ukraine's path to full NATO membership. And that was what led to the buildup. And also Turkish drones were being supplied to the Ukrainians, who started using them to escalate in the far east of the country there. And the Russians said, that's it. They started building up their forces. And then they said, here's our proposed treaty, sign it. And I'm not saying the Americans should have just got on their knees and signed whatever he said. But what they should have done is negotiate in good faith, but they didn't want to do that. And if you go back and look at what happened in December 21, January and February of 22, you see that essentially the policy was to tell Russia, you better not. And if you do, we're going to put all these sanctions on you. We're going to pour in all these weapons, and we're going to make your life as difficult as we can. But they were not willing to negotiate in good faith to prevent the war from breaking out. And the Russians' demands were essentially reasonable. And the ones that the Americans were pretending were unreasonable, like go back to 1997 lines before NATO expansion into Poland and all of that, they could have compromised halfway on those. But on the missile launchers in Romania and Poland, George W. Bush never should have done that. I mean, it's universally agreed that George W. Bush is a complete scumbag idiot whose policies were uniformly horrible. Why should it be so hard for us to admit that he shouldn't have done that? He shouldn't have put those missile stations in there. If they're that bad of a provocation, we're not worried about Iran nuking Poland, for God's sake. What kind of Dick Cheney idiocy is that? Why are we bound to that? Just dismantle them, right? Promise neutrality for Ukraine. Promise that we're closing the door on their eventual NATO membership. They said, no, we have an open door policy. And that open door policy says that no other country can ever tell us that we have to close the door to another country. And so we have an open door, and the door is open, and we won't close it, and we can't close it. And yet the whole thing is just made up, right? The whole thing is just words. There's no door. They came up with the concept in 2008. And again, it might as well have been Khrushchev, the commie commissar of who cares what, who said so. There's nothing magic about the damn door. There is no door. And they just said, no, that's it. Sorry. We have this thing that we like to say. And that's our thing we say. And that is that the door is open and we will not close it. And you cannot make us close it. And then that's it. And I'll tell you, I think it's 99% certain that this is truly the motivation, was because they wanted the war to happen. Or at least they preferred peace 51% to 49%, but they thought if the Russians are going to invade Ukraine, great. That'll be perfect. And you go back and look, and especially, again, December 21 and then January, February of 22, and you'll see time after time in the major papers, all the think tank wonks and experts and retired generals and admirals, and even Hillary Clinton talking about what we want to do is we want to arm up a Ukrainian insurgency, because it was taken for granted that the Russians would smash the Ukrainian army within a week or two. And that then the question was, because it's a huge country, it's the size of Texas, which if you don't know is really huge. That's why people say that about Texas. So
I live in Texas.
Oh, okay. There you go.
Yeah.
So, for people who don't know, from Austin, which is more or less center of Texas, it's a little bit southeast, but more or less center of Texas. From Austin to El Paso is halfway to the ocean, right? Halfway, not just to LA, but halfway to the ocean. If you just drive from the center of Texas to the west side of it. Okay. So just so people understand that that's how big it is. So the question was, if,
by the way, I live in Lubbock, and it takes, I think 5.5 hours to get to Austin.
Oh, I'm surprised it's only 5.5. I guess it must be downhill from Lubbock to
maybe 6. Yeah.
I'd have thought it was longer than that. It's a hell of a drive to the Panhandle. It sure is. So anyway, point is, was Putin, the idea was once he invades and conquers the country and smashes the military, is he going to really try to conquer the whole place? The far east of the country might accept him, although people really don't like being invaded and bombed and stuff. And then sort of the mid-east of the country, like the land between the Dnieper River and Kiev and the Donbass there and Kharkiv province and some of those, maybe. But now west of the Dnieper River, is he really going to try to take all that whole half of the country that hates his guts and wants nothing to do with him? And the idea was, we'll back the insurgency. As they said over and over, it'll be just like Afghanistan in the 80s, when Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan backed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, including the Arab Afghan army that became Al-Qaeda, to bog the Russians down and bleed them to bankruptcy, to give them their own Vietnam, as America had learned the hard way from Vietnam that, boy, we shouldn't have done that. This giant self-inflicted wound, also inflicted on the poor Vietnamese people. But, it broke the bank. It divided society back home. And it, cost untold billions of dollars. And they thought, well, listen, if the American people have Vietnam syndrome and they don't want to contain the Soviet Union anymore, they don't have the energy for any more of these wars, maybe we'll bait them into overexpansion. Instead of containing them, we'll trick them into doing the same stupid thing we just did in Vietnam. So that was where the policy came from. Walter Slocum and Zbigniew Brzezinski and others said this back in 1979. We want to get the Russians to make this mistake, to invade. We don't want them to move into West Germany. But you want to move in Afghanistan? Hey, those people are expendable, right? 1 million of them were killed. The Americans didn't care about that in the terrible war. And now I remind you that America only finished losing the Afghan war in September of 2021. So we're literally talking 2 months later. And the Democrats are saying, yeah, what we want to do is replicate our great policy in Afghanistan in the 1980s. Which, of course, led to the rise of the terrorist threat to the United States in the 90s, and then the war on terrorism in the 2000s and teens. And after they finally got out, after 20 years of losing a war, trying to fix or react from the consequences of the last time they did this, they said, we want to do that again. That's the model. We know just what we're doing. And again, they invoked Syria as well. They said, in fact, Admiral Stavridis, I believe it's the New York Times, so I believe they're paraphrasing Stavridis. He said, we admit we don't know how to defeat an insurgency, but we sure know how to back one, like we did in Afghanistan and like we did in Syria. And again, remember Syria, where they backed an insurgency there and it blew back into the rise of the Islamic State Caliphate. They had to reinvade Iraq, fight a whole other Iraq War 3 for 3 years to destroy it again. And then they go, yeah, this is the model. Afghanistan and Syria, that's what we want to do in Ukraine. And so that was the policy, was essentially, and in fact, I found one good quote of Putin saying, are they trying to lure me in? And it's like, yes, dude, you stupid. And then he did it anyway. And so, that's basically the lead up to it. They say, just the fact, and your audience should just, think about this for a minute, even if they really don't like me or anything I just said at all. Just ask yourself, how weird and unnatural is it the way every single media source repeats this mantra like it's some mass hypnosis or something? Unprovoked attack. Unprovoked attack. Russia's illegal and unprovoked invasion. Well, why do they say it like that all the time? They didn't talk about any kind. They didn't talk about when Iraq invaded Kuwait, which it was provoked, although, I don't know if to this degree even, but I don't think they just said unprovoked invasion of Kuwait, right? In this case, clearly some public relations firms decided, we tested this with the focus group, and we are making sure that this is the way that this war is discussed. We will not have discussion as you introduce this show. What's the backstory, Horton? What does 2014 have to do with 2022? We are not going to talk about that. To talk about that at all, why? That's to take Russia's side. And that is to, essentially not describe, but to, line up and ally with their morality on the subject. And all of these tales, all this propaganda, the way that they spin it. Unprovoked attack, unprovoked attack. To any critical thinking American, you ought to immediately think, well, what is that? Why do they do that? And then the answer is obvious, and or at least it'd be your first guess, because they provoked it. That's why. And they know that they're guilty, and they don't want you to look at what they did and blame them and end every one of their sentences about Ukraine with, yeah, but that's all your fault anyway, so shut up. And so they say unprovoked attack. It's supposed to be this mantra, and it's supposed to somehow, create a crowd psychology that you're going to be too intimidated to say, well, actually, Yeah, it's twofold. It's one is you have all the people that don't have time to look into things, or they get their news straight from legacy media to accept the fact that it was unprovoked is what they're saying. And so it's one of those things that's if you repeat the lie long enough, people will start to buy it and believe the lie as the truth, right? Yep. And then the second thing is, I just lost it. I had a good one. Anyway, one of the things that I wanted to touch on a little bit is. Oh wait, I know what it was. It was you were going to refer back to my point, which was about kind of the intimidation factor, right? One, it's for the ignorant that they just hear the mantra, but then two, you were going to address for the people who want to be critical. It's you have to break through that now, right?
Yeah, the go-to insult or the go-to thing is saying, "Oh, well, you're pro-Russia because you think differently than the narrative that we put out." Yep. And it's a way to shame people into acceptance of that narrative.
Yep. And it's funny too. I would especially ask conservatives going back, or for that matter, liberals, because liberals are more likely to be good on this at the time. But there's enough distance in time between then and now, I think, that right-wingers ought to be able to be honest and fair about this. How many people in this country back 20 years ago were accusing their neighbors of being pro-terrorist? Oh, you're pro-Saddam Hussein. You're pro-Osama bin Laden. You're on the side of the enemy. When mostly at the time, the people they were criticizing were liberals and leftists and libertarians who had nothing in common whatsoever with a bunch of Salafi, jihadi, suicide bomber, lunatics, or for that matter, a bunch of sort of commie, sort of fascist Baathists in Iraq, right? Even Iraqi Americans didn't like Saddam Hussein, right? So in other words, out of 300 million of us, how many were actually pro-Iraqi regime? The answer is zero, right? Zero. And yet the right half of America allowed themselves to be convinced that the left half of America just really loves Saddam Hussein a lot. Just really loves the guys that suicide kamikaze crashed our airliners into our towers and killed thousands of our own people. Oh, I guess you guys are on the side of the enemy. No, dude. See, just you guys are stupid. And you let liars manipulate you into thinking stupid, impossible things, right? It couldn't possibly be that a bunch of New Yorkers and a bunch of Texans are on the side of Osama or Saddam, who, by the way, were not on the same side as each other at all, right? It was those of us who were pointing that out were being accused of siding with both. So if you just think about how stupid that was then, now, well, it's the same thing here. I mean, you and I are a couple of Texans. I don't know your background, but I don't give a damn about Russia. I don't have a dog in this fight. In fact, if I do have a dog in this fight at all, I have extended family from Ukraine, and they're on Ukraine's side, right? But that's still like not my point. I'm a Texan and I'm an American. I want nothing to do with this. The idea that somehow I would be on the side of any country in Europe, anywhere, much less on the far side of Slovakia from here, whether that's Ukraine or whether it's Russia or Georgia or anyone else, is absolutely absurd. And frankly, it's like a pathetic and childish defense mechanism for people who can't win an argument and don't know what they're talking about, and who foolishly allow themselves to be, kind of swept away and sign up with the latest fad, which is this is the thing that we're doing right now. And which, as you saw, isn't that what happened a year and a half ago when this whole thing broke out? It was just like COVID, or it's just like Russiagate, all these people with the flags in their bios and all these things where it's this performative groupthink. This is the, like when they all got Star Wars resistance tattoos or whatever, wore their vagina hats at their big protest. This is like the trend, the fad, like, sexually maiming your young children or, whatever kind of thing. This is what they're into. And it has nothing to do with the actual place, Ukraine, or that border region in the Donbass there, and everything to do with who they are and how they fit in with the people in their little professional community or whatever it is,
When this started, I'm sorry, what?
Oh, just the Terrytown in your town. There's a neighborhood in Austin called Terrytown where all the most like important liberal Democrat types live, and they all are very correct about everything, like getting every last Ukrainian killed to try to stick it to the Russians. If that's what the central state wants them to believe in, that's what they believe in. And you have a neighborhood just like that in your town, and we all do,
Yeah, it was wild because, back when this started, obviously my 2-year-old was younger, and we would take him on walks in his stroller in the morning before everything started, before we went to work. And slowly but surely, we saw a couple of Ukraine signs go up in people's yard in Texas. And it's unbelievable because like you said, we don't have a dog in this fight. The only dog that I have in this fight is the money that's being stolen from us and sent over there.
Yep, that's exactly right. And look, I mean, people can say, and I mean, this, again, it's fair. There's obviously, it's a complicated mess in the background. The sovereign government of Ukraine has a lot of responsibility for this mess. But the Ukrainian people, I mean, their country's being invaded and destroyed. And, it makes perfect sense for anyone in the world, including Americans, to sympathize with them. Sure. The Russian people are not suffering in this. The ethnic Russians of the Donbass, yes. But It's Russian soldiers, and they are conscripts. They are slaves in the Russian army, just as they are in the Ukrainian army. Draftees being forced to fight, but they're fighting on Ukrainian soil. So if people kind of naturally feel like the Ukrainians are the underdog here and they want to side with them morally or ethically or whatever, that's fine. Who cares about that? I don't know any libertarians got a problem with that if that's how it is. But just the reality is that people got to understand, and especially, God, after, almost 2 generations of this since the end of the last Cold War, we just can't keep doing this. It doesn't work. We waste all these money, kill all these people. They estimate something like 4 million people killed in the terror wars under mostly Bush and Obama, but some Trump as well, which Joe Biden supported every bit of that all along, by the way, as senator and vice president and so forth.
One of your books is the exact feeling that most of us have, or a lot of us have, which is enough already.
Yeah. And we have in there is something like 37 million refugees. It's the greatest refugee crisis since World War II, caused by America going around spreading democracy in the Middle East and turning the place completely upside down. Sometimes we side with Iran, sometimes we side with Osama bin Laden, and then we switch back and forth again. The whole thing's completely mad. And then,
yeah,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, this is one of those situations that requires nuance, and the way that the media displays it is without nuance. So like you were saying, you can sympathize with Ukrainians, and at the same time, there's a term that not many people know, but it's strategic empathy, right?
Yeah.
Where you have to understand why Russia got involved in this and Russia did this. And it's not because you sympathize with them as in, I guess it is, but it's understanding why they got involved so that you can formulate a response to that. Right. But if you don't understand why they're doing this, then your response to it is going to most likely be incorrect.
Yep. And look, why do they get it wrong? Because they're completely full of it, right? Because they lie all day. And they have to justify and spin and obfuscate. And so, that whole unprovoked mantra, that PR push that they try to make the American people accept. And that's what they think too. They all repeat the mantra too. And, this is, to me, a real hard truth, is that it is not the case that at night, Newland and Blinken and Sullivan and Biden sit down and drink whiskey and are honest with each other about what's really going on here and what it is we're doing. Now, ready, break. Tomorrow, first thing at 7 a.m., we start lying again. But at least here tonight in this dark room, when we're whispering, we at least tell each other what we know to be true and what we're really trying to achieve and what we're really doing here, right? That's why the lies, right? To accomplish the thing that you're really trying to do. And yet, I get the idea more and more that there is no kind of honest communication like that. I mean, they know they're lying as individuals when they lie, but
That's so wild.
At the same time, they build, the whole structure, the whole policy, everything gets built on those fictions. In fact, I interview these guys all about Waco. People look at my Twitter. It's the top pinned tweet there. It's this Waco special I did. And one of the guys I talked to, wrote a book about Waco, but he was a former federal cop himself. And he said, listen, here's how it works. He goes, when you're a federal cop or in that kind of bureaucracy, he goes, there's the truth, there's falsity, and then there's our position. And truth and falsity are on one plane. And our position is on an entirely separate plane of reality from what's true and what's false. This is what we have agreed we are saying. That's our position. And once they get married to that, they can't change it, or they won't. It becomes too difficult, the way the incentives are inside the bureaucracy. I mean, to me, Syria is the best example of this, maybe the clearest example of this, where you could understand how they had fed each other a line where they believed in a room. You had a room with 6 people in it, whatever. And they said, okay, here's what we want to do. We want to back the nice moderate rebels, but not the suicide bomber, head chopper, bad guy rebels, right? And everybody went, yeah, that's real smart. Let's do that. That's the deal. That became our position. And at that point, it's etched in granite, and there's nothing that can be done to change it. And it doesn't matter if month after month after month, these rebels aren't moderate. These rebels are head chopping, suicide bombing, bin Ladenite terrorist murderers, our enemies. And there are no moderates. We're not backing moderates. The guys who say, hi, I'm a moderate, they're just here to pick up the money and the guns and deliver them to the jihadists. And then, but could they revisit that? Could they hold a meeting where they said, hey, we were all wrong when we settled on our position? And it turns out that whatever moderates here are such a small, insignificant percentage of the whole of this rebellion that this policy is nonsensical and it ain't working and we got to change it. No, they just kept right on for years until it blew up into the damned caliphate. And even then, they kept the policy in Syria all the way through until Trump was the president. It was not until the summer of 17 when Trump ordered the CIA to stop backing al-Qaeda in Syria. So even when Obama was killing them in Iraq, he was still back, even killing ISIS in Syria, he was still backing al-Qaeda in Syria for the rest of his presidency, because that's our position. And they just get, stuck in this kind of this way of thinking, which is another way of saying that they're stupid, right? They call everything that they think and do and say intelligence, but it's not. It's complete idiocy. And none of them are in a position really, I guess, to just say, come on, Jim, Bob is dumb. This is wrong. And instead of that, we need to change our mind now, because you'd have to admit that you made the dumb mistake when you chose his point of view in the first place. So it's better to just keep going and just all, the incentives of bureaucracy, right? We're like in business, you could really screw up in business. At some point, your boss has got to pull the plug before you just keep wasting more money. You know what I mean? Where here, they would rather you just keep doing it and they don't want to admit it. And in fact, they want to waste more money so they can waste more money next year. And so it's no one's real interest to call anyone else out and say, we're doing the wrong thing here.
I want to ask you about the U.S. involvement in this and what its purpose is. Is this a intentional weakening of Russia? Is this money laundering? Is this just propping up the military-industrial complex? What is this?
Yeah, look, I think money is the most important part of it. Strategy is part of it too, but it was the military-industrial complex who funded the think tanks who wrote up the strategy. And so really, the whole thing really is a self-licking ice cream cone. And you got to understand too, that just as powerful as Lockheed and Northrop Grumman and all that is just the institutional interests of the Pentagon, of the State Department, of the CIA, and all of the national security bureaucracies. They want to all do nothing but grow. And they'll never say, well, we solved the problem we were created to solve, so now we can go home and get real jobs. And so the whole thing is a self-licking ice cream cone. That's what the GIs called it in Vietnam, where they just create a crisis and then solve it. But by solving it, create a new crisis and something more that they got to do next time. And then they do that. And then they just keep going and going and going forever. And it works for them. It makes sense for them to do. So, it's not a coincidence. Although, it's not everything. But it's not a coincidence that it was Paul Wolfowitz and Scooter Libby and Zalmay Khalilzad who were, kind of the worst of these neoconservative think tankers in the early 1990s who wrote up this doctrine that now that the Cold War is over, America will be the unipolar world hegemon forever and will never allow any nation or group of nations to challenge our authority over the planet. That those guys were all bankrolled by Lockheed. And that's essentially the people that we know as, the PNAC crowd, Project for a New American Century crowd that ended up lying us into Iraq War II. And this is their doctrine. It's their doctrine in the Middle East. It's their doctrine in Eastern Europe, and for that matter, in Eastern Asia, that America will be the dominant power in all of these major regions so that nobody else can be. And so...
Speaking to that, do you think it has anything to do with BRICS?
Yeah, well, so the BRICS is the reaction to that, right? And so at the end of World War II, all of the industrial nations had been essentially burnt to the ground. I mean, England, not exactly, although they had their problems. But all of Europe had been just essentially completely destroyed. Japan had been completely destroyed. And so America was absolutely the economic powerhouse of the world. And also, I mean, hell, even just agriculture had been destroyed around the world too from the war. And so American industry and agriculture just dominated the planet, where the middle part of North America was like 60 or 70, I think 60, 65% of the global economy after World War II. And so American currency became essentially as good as gold. And even though, especially libertarians, we like to complain about how much they debase the currency, that's true. But everybody else is worse. And so there's not a central banker in the world who knows how to do anything but print money all damn day. That's all they ever do. And so relatively speaking, the dollar has been very strong, and it's given and I'm really not an economist. You really got to talk with the Austrian guys about this stuff, but in a sense, it's given the American government the same way that they export inflation to us. You know, have you ever heard of what they call Cantillon effects? This is where whoever prints the money first and gets to spend it first, they get today's value of that money. The people who get it later, they get it after it's been devalued, right? So that's the same thing that happens to us. Our government loans money into circulation. They give it to a bank. That bank invests it in some giant firm. And then that firm gets to spend that money on whatever capital resources for whatever it is that they're doing. By the time us lowly wage earners get the money, it's been devalued and our cost of living has gone up. They got the higher value of it. Well, it's the same thing with exporting all those dollars to countries overseas too, those Cantillon effects. The people who end up, you know, sitting on that pile of dollars in Gabon or wherever, when they finally get them, they've been devalued and they get to export that inflation to the world in that way. The problem is with the American empire is they have such a heavy hand. They're constantly bullying the hell out of everyone and threatening everyone and sanctioning everyone. And you know, they call us the isolationists, but they're the greatest enemies of free trade in the world. And so what happened was Russia and China, Brazil and India got together and said, you know, essentially they're the medium-sized states in the world. And so we don't have to put up with this. Let's trade between each other in our own currencies. Let's find as many ways as we can to get around America's systems of global domination, so that to make ourselves sanction proof, so that if we run afoul of the Americans, that we don't have to go hungry like the Yemenis. And so that's essentially what they did. They created this group. It's not a military alliance. It's essentially just an economic alliance. But more and more, they're, instead of using dollars for their international transactions, they're using each other's national currencies to settle their debts, which is decreasing demand on the US dollar, and which is increasing inflationary pressure here. And the Austrians talk about something that they call a crack-up boom. And this is when, in this case, we're talking on an international level. This could happen just inside a country as well. When sort of everybody realizes on the same day that, today's the day that the currency completely loses its value and everyone rushes to the exits all at once. So on an international basis, that would mean this is the day all the international bankers wake up and say, oh my God, all those dollar bills in my vault are worthless. I got to get rid of them right now. All those those treasury bills, securities, all those are worthless. I got to dump them as fast as I can before the other guy does. And at that point, our currency is completely destroyed. Now, I don't know if that's really a threat of, you know, something that could happen or something that's really in the offing here. I think, you know, one thing is that again, every other central banker is just as bad at this as the United States is. And so I saw a funny tweet where the Indians tried to pay the Russians for some natural gas in rupees. And the Russians were like, yeah, no, I don't think so. And so then the guy said, yeah, everybody's a multipolarist until somebody tries to settle their debts in rupees. And then all of a sudden, yeah, not so much anymore. So we'll see how it goes with that. As we know, the dollar definitely has its own problems as well. But that's, you know, an attempt for them to get out from under the United States. I'm sorry, I just realized how overtime it is here, and I really have to go, man.
No, you're good.
But thank you so much for having me on. It's been a lot of fun. And sorry I went on so damn long on that first question there. I hope it's all right.
No, I appreciate you coming on, man. Before you go, do you want to shout out where people can find you and buy your books?
Sure. So I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute. We got a really great group of libertarian writers and podcasters there. And check out all our great books there. That's libertarianinstitute.org. I'm the editorial director of Antiwar.com, which is the most important project on the internet. We got all the bad news for you there every day. And then I host the Scott Horton Show. That's at scotthorton.org. I got 6,000 interviews, almost 6,000 interviews going back 20 years there at scotthorton.org. And then I wrote Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. And then I have two books that are collections of interviews. One is The Great Ron Paul, and the other is Hotter Than the Sun, Time to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And all those are available at scotthorton.org or at libertarianinstitute.org. And I'm on the radio in LA every Thursday at 2:30 on KPFK 90.7 FM.
Awesome. Well, guys, I appreciate you listening to this episode. If you would like and share with a friend, word of mouth and spreading is how, we get the word out. And there's no more important word than being anti-war. So I appreciate everybody listening. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you, man. Really appreciate it.